All right, so welcome back to class, and today we're going to hit video 17, which is all about my man Galileo and how he changed everything. Now I want you to remember where we are in the week's discussion. We've got two models. We've got over here, we had the geocentric model of Ptolemy and Aristotle with the Earth in the middle and all the planets going around it, featuring epicycles for retrograde motion and jazz like that. Over here, due to Nicholas Copernicus, 1543, proposed that the sun was in the middle of the solar system. Actually, they didn't call it the solar system, it was just the universe. And the sun was in the middle and all the planets, including the Earth, went around it. And Copernicus explained retrograde motion by sort of an optical illusion due to the revolution, that is the full-scale motion of the Earth around the sun. Okay, and that model was not new. It was due originally, so far as we can tell, to Aristarchus back several hundred years before Jesus of Nazareth walked the planet. And so it was an old idea, but Copernicus made it new and made it believable, almost believable. But it was Galileo who popularized, about 70 years after Copernicus died, Galileo began to popularize this idea. So for 60 years or so, nobody really, astronomers noticed and took Copernicus seriously, but in general, nobody else did. Some philosophers, read the book, thought it was interesting, but didn't really, it never got out, to the broader population of people. It was never popularized. That required Galileo, okay? And Galileo didn't get in trouble because he proved anything. He never proved anything at all. What Galileo really was effective at was disproving the old system. And we'll see just how that happened. Okay. The thing that made Galileo really different from people before him is that he got his hands on a telescope. He never invented the telescope, but he got his hands on a telescope which had been invented by a Dutch spectacle maker. Hans Lippershey was his name. He invented the telescope. Galileo was the first one to pick it up and to turn it to the sky and to make really, really, really careful observations. So that is where Galileo was really different. That's what made him new, okay, were his observations. And we're going to talk about this pen, it breaks my heart. It does. This pink pen has been flattened by somebody. 4 observations and it no longer functions very well. Yet I'm going to keep on trying to, out of hopes that it will begin to function well. But there it goes. It's basically no good at all. So I'm going to actually throw it on the floor now and not return to it. So 4 observations that Galileo made that were really important. And I'm going to present them in order of increasing importance. All of them drew Aristotle's model of the universe into question. The last one actually disproved it, but all of them at least drew them into question. So he took the telescope and he turned it toward the moon and other things. He also figured out a way, first off, he figured out a way to take the telescope, make the sun shine through it and project onto a screen. And he discovered that the sun had sunspots on it. I don't know if you know it, ever heard of sunspots before, but oftentimes the sun has these big dark regions on it, and they came to call them sunspots because they're spots on the sun. We'll talk later on in the class about what those actually are. Okay, but all we need to know now is that Galileo saw there were sunspots on the sun. And this actually was a pretty big deal because Aristotle, who had lived 1,500 years earlier, but whose influence at the time of Galileo was enormous. All of the, virtually all of the theology and all of the philosophy of the day, that is, nearly the complete worldview, was not just formed by the Bible on one hand, but from Aristotle on the other. And so Aristotle was everywhere, especially in the universities. And Aristotle had said that all of the heavenly bodies are perfect without blemish. Okay, they were perfect spheres with no marks on them, no blemish on them whatsoever. And so this was an axiom of Aristotle's cosmology. And so when Galileo turned and saw the sunspots, well, here's something that actually looks like it's part of the sun. And the argument was, are these sunspots part of the sun, or are they something that are out in front of the sun, which are obscuring the sun, kind of like clouds or something, which made the sun look dim? Galileo argued that the sunspots were actually part of the sun itself, and in that he was right. But to suggest that something in the cosmos outside of the Earth had spots on it, as ridiculous as it sounds to us today, was widely disbelieved. It poked holes in a system that virtually everybody believed in. It poked holes in the authority of Aristotle. So sunspots was one thing that got people talking about Galileo. The second one, was this the marker I was using? I get so confused so easily. Number two, the second observation that Galileo made with his new telescope that he didn't invent, but he just was able to figure out how to make one, having heard about one, was that there were mountains on the moon. Now, of course, today we all know there are mountains on the moon, like there are on Mars and like there are on Venus and every other terrestrial planet and moon. Okay, there's mountains there. But with his telescope, he was able to essentially prove that they were mountains, because he was a really good observer and knew how to make an argument based on observation. And this was another thing that kind of started poking at the overall worldview of Aristotle, which again had saturated the thought of the universities at the time, and had also deeply influenced the church at the time. So there are mountains on the moon. Again, Aristotle had said that all heavenly bodies were perfectly, smooth and perfectly featureless. But now there were mountains on the moon, and so the authority of Aristotle again kind of came into question. The third one, and we're going to get closer and closer to the heart of the matter here. The third one is that Galileo discovered that Jupiter, the planet, has moons. Moons of Jupiter. And here's what that looked like. Now, when he looked up at the sky, through his telescope, he would see like Jupiter made a disk like this. It was a bright circular disk. And he looked at it one night and realized that there were 3 little stars all in a row. So 1, 2 there, and then 1 over here. The next night he looked again. This is the second night, so there's the disk of Jupiter. Now there were 4. And they were a little bit differently oriented. The next night, there were only 2, and they were both over here. The 4th night, they were all 4 over here. Okay, so night 1, night 2, night 3, and night 4, and so forth and so on, ... And so what was happening here, he proposed, is that he was looking at like a little miniature solar system edge on. So and that each one of these little 4 spots was a moon. And what they were looking at it at different times as these little moons went around Jupiter. Sometimes this moon would be over here, sometimes it would orbit around front and then come over here and then go around back. There were 4 of them. Sometimes they were in front of or behind the planet, as in this case here. There were 2 lined up in front of or behind the planet here so that you couldn't see them. Up here, there was 1 that was blocked. There were 3 moons total, visible. 1 of them was in front of or behind the planet here. And so as time went on and these different little moons took different periods of time to go around, they would sometimes be on the left, sometimes on the right. Sometimes you'd see all 4, sometimes you just see 2. Sometimes you just see 1. That was very rare, almost never happened. But he began to realize he was seeing moons of Jupiter. And so that's how he understood this. And no matter where Jupiter went in the sky, these little moons, he called them stars. These little stars followed Jupiter. Now this was a little bit radical because another thing that Aristotle had said is that everything orbits the Earth. The Earth is the center of all motion. Well, obviously we have a case here where something other than the Earth, that is the planet Jupiter, is the center of motion. So again, all of this tended to throw the Aristotelian worldview into question and began to complicate things. Okay? And nothing here disproves the Ptolemaic/Aristotelian geocentric system, the one we had on the left-hand side of the screen before. You know, none of this disproves that, but it does call into question the Aristotelian worldview, which dominated, I've now said 3 times, the world of Galileo. Okay. Now these 3 observations were published in a book called The Starry Messenger. In 1610. Okay, and one thing Galileo did was when he published these observations, these 3 observations, he published them in Latin. I'm sorry, reel that one in. He published this book, The Starry Messenger, in Italian, which was the language of the common people. Before this, all philosophy, all science had been published in Latin, which was sort of the language of the learned, right? The people, the highly educated. And so the people who were not well educated couldn't read it, and so it never really filtered into those circles. But Galileo was a great popularizer. He was really good at PR, and he realized that if he published this in Italian and not the highfalutin Latin, that the common people could read it and he would make a splash. Boom! And he did. He became famous throughout Europe overnight, especially with this rather exciting observation of the moons of Jupiter. And the people in the universities hated him. Okay, hated him because he made these observations and he was really, really good at arguing his point. Okay, he was really good with the zingers, the one-liners. He'd be great on Twitter. All right, he'd be fantastic on social media. But these 3 observations began to set the stage for the 4th observation, which really slammed the old Ptolemaic Aristotelian system. And that observation is coming up next.